Morning, everybody. How are you all doing? Weird night last night. Woke up about 3 o'clock in the morning, even though I'm short of sleep, and decided to get up and prepare this video for you, just for you. So I stayed up a couple of hours to do a little bit of research, and yeah, so I thought we'd do like a complete tour of all the gambits that I know. Right? Oh yeah, I'm a self-confessed gambit nerd. I'm a gambit addict. You know, so be it. I find it a fun way to play chess. But first, before we go into a list of about, I don't know, 20 or 30 gambits, it's not all of them by a long chalk. There's a lot of gambits out there. Let's just talk a little bit about what is a gambit, why do you play a gambit, and who should play a gambit, and when should you play a gambit. So, the idea in general is, with a gambit, is that you offer your opponent a pawn, 2 pawns, 3 pawns, sometimes even a whole piece, but because your opponent has to spend time on the capture instead of on development, you get some compensation for the material. So you'll get quite often, quicker development, you'll get more pieces out to the board, you'll get quicker control over the board, and possibly, hopefully, that's what you're banking on. You're banking on attacking chances before your opponent can recover and find time to get his king safe, and so on and so forth. So, very often, you'll see a bit of a theme when you get central pawns that you will want to deflect the central pawns quite often onto the F file or C file. And notice, let's say, we're just from white's perspective, okay? Let's say I could play a pawn here, for example. Try and tempt this pawn away from the center onto the F file, but where it can then be recaptured at some point in the future, hopefully by my bishop. Same thing goes with the pawn here. I'm trying to deflect the D pawn to become a C pawn and then be recaptured again, okay? There are other ideas, all right? For example, taking a pawn, it's me to move. So let you say they take a pawn, you can offer a second pawn, okay? So this central pawn is still a central pawn. You can offer a second pawn and say, please have another pawn, but that you then immediately recapture with a knight, okay? So we're looking at these same patterns which occur quite a lot. Not every time, but here, for example, white has 2 pieces developed to black's 0 pieces. Although black is up 1 pawn, white should have very good attacking chances. And also, another thing about getting rid of the central pawns is that your bishops can often get very good access to the board. So with that in mind, let's spin around, and I've started to put together a Lichess study, which I'll link to. Lichess study of all Hunty's Gambits. All right, so now a lot of these I've played, some of them I know but haven't ever had the balls to play, and some of them I've just found on my travels and thought, that'd be interesting, so I'm going to throw this in. So, I've got 13 chapters here. We're going to start with, from the white perspective, 1e4, e5, okay? So we go da-da. Okay, so let's start with the classic, the beauty, that is the King's Gambit, right? Here's the King's Gambit. So the idea is that you want black to capture this pawn, after which you can grab full control over the center. And what's more, this bishop is now looking at this pawn, is going to try and capture it back at some point in time, okay? So absolute classic. If you do it on the other side of the board, it's the Queen's Gambit, right? You're trying to tempt this pawn to here. We will come to the Queen's Gambit. Okay, back again. Now another one that's a particular favourite of mine, the centre game with 2d4. Trying to tempt the pawn here, and then you offer another pawn, and this is the Danish Gambit. Okay, so here is one of those examples. In fact, it's more than even a 2-pawn gambit. Well, kind of 1 pawn. So you can play it like this, where you recapture with the knight, and you are in gambit territory because you have a piece developed, whereas black does not. So you've both got 1 central pawn. This is okay. But more common in the Danish, you actually offer a 3rd pawn, okay, which is really only a second pawn, because if they take, you recapture with the bishop, and you have these very strong bishops. So that's the Danish. Now, we looked at the King's Gambit with the immediate f4. One other, which I have played many times, is the Vienna Gambit, okay? So you bring out your knight to c3 first. This is the Vienna game. And knight to c6 is the most common move, but only just behind it, knight to f6. And if you follow that with f4, this is the Vienna Gambit. So it's just the same structure as the King's Gambit, but you've got these two knights out, and the idea being that if they accept, you get to push this pawn further into the centre, gaining space, but with tempo, forcing this knight back. Not good. Right? The only alternative really for black is to block with the queen and pin the pawn, but then you refute that with queen e2, and you are just better. So that's the Danish Gambit. Now, let's move into knight f3, knight c6 lines. Right? I've got a whole kind of repertoire about this. We'll start with the Scotch. Okay, so this is from the white perspective, remember. So the Scotch game looks like this with d4. Okay, black has two attackers, white has two defenders. Okay, if they take the pawn, the most classic move here is for the knight to recapture. Okay, but you don't have to do that. Bishop to c4 here is the Scotch Gambit, right? And there's another wrinkle on this as well, which you can look into if you wish, called the Göring Gambit. The Göring Gambit continues with c3. You can see the same patterns coming over and over again. Okay, so this is the Göring Gambit. I don't know anything about that. The Scotch Gambit here. This can lead to something also very exciting called Haxo Gambit. Okay, if their bishop comes out again, because you've still got two attackers on here, their bishop comes out to defend the pawn, like you will see in other lines like the Budapest Gambit and sometimes England Gambit, then you can go down the Haxo line, now with c3, right? And if they take, you play the best move in chess. Bishop takes, f7 check, and if king takes, out comes the queen with a fork on king and bishop, and I have won many games this way. Alrighty, now we come back to here. And what if we play bishop to c4? So this is the Italian game. Now, I'm astonished that I've made it this far without ever hearing that there was such a thing called the Italian Gambit. This is the Italian game. This is the gioco piano. Very common. It is the most common response by black here. And then blow me down if there isn't something called the Italian Gambit here. Most common moves here are c3, castles, d3, yada, boring. But here, scoring 51% for white is also called the Rosentreter Gambit, but the Italian Gambit. And just throwing your pawn straight into the middle of the board. And now, white wins 51% of the time from here. The most common move by a mile from black is to go, well, look, I've got three attackers on that pawn. You know, you can only summon up two defenders, and the second one's your queen. So that will be my pawn. Thank you very much. And now you proceed with c3. And look, if black gets greedy and captures the other pawn, Danish style, right? Then guess what? You don't recapture the knight. No, that's for sissies. We've strapped on a big pair, and we are big gambit playing boys. Bishop takes f7 check. I like this. King takes f7, right? Then black only wins 30% of the time from here. You know what's coming next. It's queen d5 check. Happy days. So that is a twist on your Scotch Gambit, Haxo Gambit, but you can do it from the Italian game. What's not to like? Right, that is all good. I think we've covered everything now in the e4, e5. At least everything that's, you know, in my universe. Let's move on to another popular opening you may have heard of called the Sicilian defense. So if you're an e4 player, you will see black increasingly the stronger you get, you'll see black play pawn to c5, the Sicilian. Okay. Now, Probably the most classic of all of these is D4, the Smith-Morra Gambit. Okay, and sometimes it's known more as the Morra Gambit in Europe. And if pawn takes here, you know what you're doing. You offer the second pawn. If they take, you recapture with a knight. So, recap. We've given up one pawn because we now no longer have a D pawn. But we're going to try and use that to our advantage. But we have a piece developed. We have a pawn in the centre. Black has neither of those things and can't do both of those things in one turn. That's the price that Black has paid for his extra pawn. So what we need to do now is develop very, very quickly, etc., etc. Now then, so from here, from the Sicilian, there are a few others that it may be worth noting. Okay, so there's also a twist on this. If you go D4 takes knight to F3, it's called the Morphy Gambit. Now this doesn't score as well on average for white. Yeah, you're putting two attackers on here. You could have just grabbed the pawn straight back anyway with the queen though. This is known as the Morphy Gambit. I don't know any more about it. You can look into it if you choose. Okay, so this is back to the Smith-Morra. Another idea from here is to strike out immediately with pawn to B4. Now this is kind of different because now we're trying to tempt the pawn here where we have no piece that can recapture imminently, right? But what we are doing is we're saying, look, we want now to grab the whole centre, get our knights out, you know, maybe even do this, push A3, tempt the pawn again, sometimes recapture with the bishop, kind of pinning this pawn. So this pawn can't move because then you can take the bishop and force the king to lose castling rights. So that's the wing gambit. And there are yet other twists on that. You might play the open Sicilian with knight to F3, and if D6, which is the second most common move after knight C6, for example, you can then play B4. And this is known as the delayed wing gambit or deferred wing gambit. And again, you're trying to mess up all of Black's ideas, and white does all right from here. And there's yet another one from here. You can go A3, right? Then with the idea of playing B4. So let's say knight C6, most common move, then B4. Okay, and this is known as the Mengarini variation, or another kind of deferred wing gambit. So there's lots and lots of things against the Sicilian that you can try. Now, what about the boring old positional French? Are there any exciting ones here? Well, yes, there are. I'm glad you asked. Okay, so the French starts with pawn to E4, pawn to E6, right? Black's general idea is to push D5. This is what E6 supports. And almost always will want to push pawn to C5 at some point soon as well. Okay, now there are some ideas. The immediate C4. Kind of preventing this idea, but Black nearly always plays it anyway. Huge majority of the time, over half the time, they play this anyway. So this is the Orthoschnapp Gambit. So you take the pawn. When they recapture, you do not then come after this pawn. You bring your queen out, classically to B3, but there's also queen A4 check as well. Very exciting, very open, and your French player is already going to be thinking, what the hell is going on here? This is not the French defense that I'm used to. Well, no, it isn't, and that's kind of the whole point. All right, what else have we got? What else have we got here? Well, we could just carry on with normal French style. D4, grab the center, yeah, like normal, and they will nearly always play pawn to D5, and then you have other options, right? We have, for example, knight C3, okay, pawn takes. Stop me if you've seen this before. What's the idea? F3, right? And Black will think, well, look, this pawn's already offside. This pawn is already in my opponent's half, undefended, unsupported. I've already captured one pawn. I'm in for a penny, in for a pound. Might as well grab another one. And you capture them back with a knight. Very kind of, you know, similar kind of shapes that we're used to seeing. And this is known as the Giertz-Peters Gambit. Okay, might try this one. Could be good. However, there are alternatives as well. You can push E5 here and go into the French advanced variation, right? Black is going to push C5 because he's a French player and that's what French players do, okay? And now you can go the Frenkel Gambit, okay, with pawn to b4. And if they take, right, you can even push a3 and try and tempt them to take again, and then you build this super, super strong, bulletproof, dark squared pawn chain in the middle of the board. You're going to grab this fella back at some point, but you've got this space advantage, and this knight's going to have to come into the game the long way round. So that's the Frenkel Gambit. There is also another alternative from this point. Yeah, what about knight f3? They'll play knight c6 and then b4. That's also playable. This is Nimzovich's system in the blah blah blah. Anyway, so much for that. This is an interesting one, the French wing gambit. We've looked at the Sicilian wing gambit. Here's the French wing gambit. Okay, if you fancy this, you forego to d4, right, and you allow black to grab the center. Okay. Now here the most common move is e takes d5, but what about we just push e5, and black will think, hello, what's going on here? They push c5, right? Now black does well from this position in general, right? But the wing gambit, 54% for white here, b4. Okay, and again we're tempting them to take, right? Then we push d4, and again we want to get rid of this pawn. We want to solidify our dark squared control in the middle of the board and romp home, and it's 53% to 43% in white's favour from this point. So all good fun. They play the knight out here, you go after this pawn, and you just build, finish this dark squared pawn chain. All good. Right, while we're on the subject of boring oppositional defences, many people's favourite, the Caro-Kann defence. Caro-Kann starts with pawn to e4, pawn to c6. So here, kind of like the French, where white prepares the move d5 with pawn to e6, instead he's using the bishop's pawn, not a central pawn, with the idea of competing for here. And if we take, he recaptures with a wing pawn or bishop's pawn and maintains his 2 pawns in the middle. Okay, but there are things that you can do here. All right, so you always push d4, they always push d5, and now there's a few ideas. So there's a couple that I'm used to from this knight to c3 line. I'm sure there are others. Sure, there are plenty of others. Wikipedia has a list of all the gambits if you want to check that out. Just go on Wikipedia and type in chess gambits. There's a whole page on it. And here with the knight to here, what we're doing is we are tempting the pawn to capture in the center. Okay, if they capture, a couple of ideas, right? You can go immediately for the Rasa-Studier Gambit. Okay, so this is similar to the Giertz-Peters Gambit. I got them confused in a video the other day. Forgiveness requested. Okay, and if they take here, you know the drill. It's knight takes f3, and white is winning 55% of the games from this point. Again, we've got 2 knights in the board. These 2 knights control the entire center. Yeah, we've given up an extra pawn, but look at what we're going to get. We get this bishop out, maybe short castles. So Vienna players facing the Caro-Kann might be interested in this line as well. But that's not all. Okay, you don't even have to offer this straight away. You could do what I'm doing at the moment, which is bishop c4 and the von Hennig. You can go von Hennig Gambits as well, right? Most common move by a long way is knight to f6, and then you can do this, right? And I'll show you. You've probably seen this if you've been watching my videos. Takey, right? And then if they come out and pin your knight, you can immediately go there and you go, oh no, my queen, right? If they take the queen, that's checkmate, right? Or you can go bishop to here, and if king takes, knight to here with a fork on the king. And when the king moves again, you come back and you grab this. And the idea is at some point you stick your queen there and checkmate him. Okay? So that's lots and lots of fun too. Alrighty, what about when we face the Dutch? If you're a d4 player and you face the Dutch, okay? Now, I'm not a d4 player, so I don't face the Dutch, and I haven't got much to say about it. But if you are a d4 player, let's say you play the London, because a lot of people do, and you see the Dutch with one f5, then you may choose to go down the route of pawn to e4, the Staunton Gambit, and this is very, very spiky indeed. White wins 56% of the time from here, okay? And if you learn the Staunton Gambit better than your Dutch playing opponent, then you could do all right here. And really, there is almost no continuation from black here that is equalising. This is a really, really tricky one, but that's all I know about it, and that's all I'm going to say on that. While we're on the subject of pawn to d4 though, you could find yourself in this territory. So d4, and if they respond with d5, okay, you could get into the Blackmar Gambit. So this is the Blackmar Gambit. You are offering what looks like to be a free pawn, okay? And then the classic Blackmar Gambit would continue with f3, right? And take, and knight takes. Yeah, we've seen it all before. The Blackmar-Diemer Gambit continues with this line. And we'll just look a little bit more. Knight comes out to defend the pawn. You offer pawn number 2. They say thank you very much. And you've got a couple of options now. The main option in the Blackmar-Diemer is knight takes here. But if you want to spice it up even more, you could go for the Ryder Gambit, which is liquid sex when it works. Okay, you take that with the queen. Now, I'll show you the sexy trap, right? Because your queen has moved, your queen is no longer defending this pawn. And black goes, haha, you dumbass, you hung your pawn. And you go, yeah, well, I'm going to attack your queen. And then black goes, oh, right, okay, so now I need to move my queen. What's undefended? This pawn is undefended. So if they slide over here, right, you go, haha, but now I castle, and guess what? There's nothing on the d-file, right? But then black goes, I am definitely playing a dumbass, because I have an amazing skewer now on the queen and the rook, okay? At which point, you go, and just move your knight. And then black's thinking, oh well, easy points, thank you very much. I take your queen. And you go, yeah, but checkmate wins. Yeah? Because we are controlling the whole d-file thanks to long castling, and the knight comes in with check, and there's nothing they can do. Thank you very much. Alright, so that's the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit, possibly going into the Ryder Gambit if you've strapped on a very, very big pair. Now, let's come back to here. Okay, and instead of the Blackmar Gambit, what about everybody's favourite, the Queen's Gambit? Okay, obviously named after a very popular Netflix series. Okay, the Queen's Gambit, again, it's the same thing that we've looked at. You're trying to tempt away the central pawn off onto the flank, where you can then grab the centre. Now, they very, very often don't do it. Most of the time they won't do it, they won't accept. When they accept, it's 55% in white's favour. Okay, so Queen's Gambit accepted. Most popular move here is knight to c3, and you just play on. You're going to grab the centre, you're going to develop your stuff. This bishop can come out and grab that pawn. Happy days. Right, now, a lot of the time they won't accept. You've got classic Queen's Gambit declined, or you've got the Slav. If you play both, I think it's called the semi-Slav, but that's pretty much all I know about that. Black has some ideas of his own at this point. Actually, black can play the Zilbermints here. Zilbermints, what a great name. Zilbermints Gambit. I don't know much about this, but it's not very good for black at all. White wins 62% of the time from here. They'll usually just grab the pawn and say thank you very much. Okay? However, maybe a bit more popular, the Albin Countergambit. And this one is kind of funky, right? In this one, the pawn, d takes e5 is most common. It's a free pawn, okay? But then you've got to check out this the Lasker trap. If you want to play this as white, you need to understand the Lasker trap and how to refute it, okay? After they bring in their pawn, but we're not going to waste time going into traps today because we're talking about gambits. While we're on the subject, what is a counter gambit? Answer is, it doesn't really mean anything, okay? In some cases, you are declining a gambit and offering another gambit, so you're like offering a pawn of your own instead. in some cases, but there are things called a counter gambit that don't do that at all. It's really just a kind of hangover that some moves end up getting called counter gambits and some get called gambits, so don't worry about it. Nothing to stress about. Okay, now, yeah, if they accept, we've got this. And another idea, so London players, you may see this, okay? So you play d4, they play d5, you then bring out your bishop, because you always do. By the way, you've got to watch out for the England Gambit. Do not ever auto, pre-move the bishop coming out. I have had games where I play the England Gambit as black, put my pawn here, they slam their bishop out there and just lose their bishop. Ha ha. Okay. However, if we have this and we have this, okay, there is something called the Steinitz Countergambit as well, which is like the mirror image of the Calabrese Countergambit that we're going to see shortly. Okay, so again, just contesting the centre, and really you can just freestyle with this stuff, right? Anytime you see a pawn in the centre, you can think, I'm going to play a gambit. You don't have to know what it's called. Try and deflect that pawn, and then hopefully compete for the centre, maybe knight to here, and then push the pawn. Things like that. But that pretty much covers 1d4, because I don't play it, so I'm not very interested in it. I do, however, as an e4 player, sometimes face the Scandinavian. All right, we've dealt with the French and so on and so forth. Now, Scandinavian starts with you playing pawn to e4, and dummy over the road plays pawn to d5. Okay, and the most common continuation is pawn takes and queen takes, and you're into the Scandinavian, which is what black expects. But we don't want to do what black expects. We want to surprise black and upset him and make him cry. Therefore, here's a couple of ideas for you. The Tennison Gambit is a whole heap of fun. Now, this will work in Blitz and Bullet. The Tennison Gambit, it's dubious. It's already dubious. It's already -1 here for black. Why? Because you're just giving up a pawn, and it comes with tempo, right? Most common move here, by a mile, is d takes e4, okay? Now, you can then go down the ICBM line, right? The Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, where you pivot your knight round here and attack the pawn, okay? Now, if they play knight to f6 and defend the pawn, you can play d3, attacking the pawn again. Stockfish thinks I'm a fool, right? If they take here, you recapture with your bishop, okay? This is important. This is important. And now they go, well, I don't like this knight hovering around here, okay? I'm going to put an h6. h6 is the most common move in this position by some way, with 34.1%, so more than 1 in 3 games, they'll just push h6, and phew, the eval bar has just gone right up in white's favour. Why? Because you capture on f7, with the knight, okay? And you are forking the queen and the rook, okay? And this is now 83% for white. Most common move, by a mile, king takes, and then big bada boom, bishop to g6. The king is in check. The king cannot retreat to here because he's still in check, and that's not allowed, right? So nearly always the king's going to take the bishop, and you're going to take the queen and say thank you very much. I'm just going to enjoy winning this game at my leisure. All right, so that's the Tennison Gambit, or the ICBM version of it. Not sound at all, but you may have a lot of fun with it. Now, there are other options. Okay, we have the very dubious looking knight to c3 at this point. Okay, and if they take here, right, which is kind of okay, then you play f3. This is known as the Doughtery Gambit, and yeah, they'll probably take the pawn. You recapture with the knight. Same kind of position as we've seen over and over, but more of the time they're going to hit your knight here, and then you'll need to reroute your knight, and you'll do okay from this point, but at least you've thrown your Scandinavian playing opponent off the scent to some degree. But that's really all I've got as white against the Scandi. Let's move on to chapter number 8. There's a couple of piece gambits that I want to share with you. We have for example, e4, e5, they play knight to f3. There's a few ideas here, okay? Knight to c6, so you get the Russian game, okay, or Petrov defense. Okay, you can, if you take here and they push d6, there is the very spicy indeed knight takes f7. This is known as the Cochrane Gambit. I think I did a whole video on that at one point. It's just really, really spicy, really, really dangerous. White does actually win. Right, if the king doesn't take the pawn, white's winning about 90% of the time from here because, well, they've got to take the pawn, haven't they? Right? So they take the pawn, and then you get into all kinds of issues. Yes, you've displaced their king, but you've given up a whole piece to do it. I don't know. I don't really buy it. Anyway, what about knight to c6? Right, very normal. Okay, you play knight c3. This is the three knights. Okay. And there's a couple of directions you can go from here. Let's first look at the Halloween Gambit from the four knights, right? The Halloween Gambit. Okay, knight takes e5. Computer hates it because when they take your knight, you then push d4. They have to retreat their knight either to here or to here, in which case you push e5. Now, and you just carry on harassing these knights. Now, this is 50% winning for white from this point, but I would much, bless you, I would much rather play the Vienna version of it, okay? So the Vienna version goes like this, and it's Vienna Gambit declined with knight here, right? And this is now +2 for white. So you capture here, hitting this. If they take, then you push d4, and they retreat again. Doesn't matter where they go, you push e5. And guess what? You've still got your horsey, right? So that's far preferable. And this is just winning. This is really, really good for white. So anyway, we're not going to go too far into that. So after knight to c6, which is very, very typical. Okay. What about this one? What about the immediate capture? Like, really? Can that be possible? Can that be playable? Can white win? Well, the answer to that is usually not really, no. Because Stockfish already has it -3.2. Okay. This is known as the Irish Gambit. Right, the Irish Gambit. They'll take your knight, really. Okay, and then you push d4, and you push the knight away. But it's not very clever. Okay, this is actually now known as the Chicago Gambit, or the Schulze-Müller Gambit. But really, guys, it ain't clever. It ain't clever. Well, I just thought I'd show it to you because I came across it and thought, what the hey? All right, let's flip the board now and let's look at the black side of things. Let's look at the black side of things. What can black play? Well, let's start with the classic e4, e5, knight to f3. And there are lots of ways it can go from here. Now, you could continue, for example, with the Latvian Gambit, which is what I've been playing recently. Latvian Gambit, you're getting straight into Gambit territory all the way from move 2. Okay, there are a couple of things they can do. Again, see here, we're trying to tempt the central pawn onto the wing where it can be recaptured by bishop later on. But the other thing, it's actually a double gambit because you're gambiting both pawns. Neither pawn is defended. And at lower levels, you'll see pawn takes f5 more often. Later on, you'll see knight takes here a bit more often. There is an extremely dubious response that I discovered in my research from white called the Lobster Gambit, and this takes them from +1.4 to -2.5. It's just wrong on so many levels. You can take either pawn, and it's probably winning. F takes e4, hitting the knight. Both hitting the knight. Yeah, F takes e4 is better according to the fish, by some way actually. F takes e4 is the way to go, right? You maintain your central pawns, you've even got a bonus extra central pawn, you're going to push this, you're going to try and recapture that. That ain't clever, don't do it. Okay. Now, from this position again, there are lots of different things that your opponent might do, okay? Hang on. Not from there. So if you play knight c6, then we get into kind of familiar territory here. We could get the Italian, we could get the Spanish game, we could get the Scotch, etc. We could get the Ponziani. Okay, and they've all got similar responses. Okay, if they play bishop c4, the Italian game, you can play pawn to f5, the Russo. Right, they're going to take this. If they take, then you need to play knight to f6. Well, actually, you can play e4 straight away and embarrass the knight. The knight will probably retreat, and then d5 is playable. Knight to f6 is also good, because you need to be careful about this. Okay, so that's the Russo in response to the Italian. What if they don't do the Italian? What if they play the Spanish? Same kind of deal. You've got pawn to f5, the Danish Gambit, or Schliemann defense, again offering the pawn, and so on and so forth. If instead they go for two knights, with knight to c3, you can still play f5. This is known as the Winawer defense. It's not as strong from the Black's perspective, but it ain't bad. 48 to 48, so equal winning here. Although the fish favours white here. And instead, if they push c3, this is the Ponziani opening, then again you can push f5, the Ponziani Countergambit, and Black actually wins 52% against 44 from this point. Okay, so all things worth looking into, but if you want to avoid all of that nonsense, you can go straight for f5 on move 2 and just play the Latvian Gambit and learn one gambit instead of a bunch of different but not that different ones. Okay, there is also this that you can play on move 2. This is known as the Busch-Gass Gambit. Definitely worth looking into. It is dubious. The machine has white as plus 2.2 at this point, and actually white goes on to win 53% of the time. So it's not really, I mean, that's pushing it a bit too far even for me, so I don't really fancy that. Another alternative, which actually does much better, is the Elephant Gambit. The Elephant Gambit with 2d5. What the huh? Right? E takes d5, this is 48-48, okay? And again, you push e4. You push e4 and embarrass the knight. They will likely do this, and you just defend with knight to f6 and stuff like that. I guess you can even play queen e7. And this really is kind of 50-50. Black has very good chances from this position, so that's that one. Alrighty, now let's look here again from the Italian. You have another option, right? You have the option of knight to f6. So if you don't want to play f5 and go down all of those lines, this is like the Freddy Krueger repertoire, you could play your knight out here and go into something rather interesting. Okay, the knight is very likely knight to g5, most common move, 31.8% of the time, right? Because white's going, hang on, you can't stop me from capturing on here with either my bishop or my knight, so I'm going to do that. And then you play the Ponziani-Steinitz Gambit, aka the bad motherfucker, right? Now this is plus 3.6 for white. The fish says this is a walk-in, right? But guess what? Guess what? Black wins 54% of games from this point. I've got a whole video on that. That's all I'm going to say on this one, but it's a whole heap of fun. So I think then we are pretty much covered. And there's so many tricks and traps in this one. It really is a lot of fun. If they take the knight, then you just respond with d5, you know, and you're in a very good position from this point. Look, you've got the whole center, you know, it's not going to end well. So you're not sacrificing your knight at all there. Now, what if you're a Scandi player? Have you got options as a Scandi player? Well, yes, you do. I'm glad you asked this. Okay, so you play d5 against 1e4. Okay, now they will usually accept the gambit. They accept the offered pawn. This is not a gambit, by the way. It looks a bit like a gambit, but the queen's defending the pawn, right? So that, you know, the normal continuation is pawn takes, queen takes, and material is equal, so it's not called a gambit. By far the majority of the time, more than 3/4 of games, they will take the pawn. And now you've got a couple of options. Okay, now, so what I play here is knight to f6. Okay, this is the modern variation of the Scandinavian. And from here, the best move is d4. Okay, but we'll look at that in a second. You are attacking this pawn now twice. Okay, but both attackers are pieces. So some players will go, well, I can just defend with a pawn. And now if he takes with a knight or with a queen, I capture a piece with a pawn. Okay, it makes perfect sense. But now as black, you have this resource. You have pawn to e6. Okay, offering the second pawn. They will, vast majority of the time, they will take it. This is 80% of the time they will take. And then you recapture with this guy, this bishop. Okay, this is known as the Icelandic Gambit or the Icelandic Palm Gambit. And it's, you know, it's all interesting from there. Now, coming back to here. So, in fact, let me just finish on that one. A little bit more on the Icelandic Gambit. You push this, they take that. Most common move is d4 from this point, and you can throw in bishop b4 check. But one of the general ideas is that you're going to put your queen here on e7 with the idea of recapturing this pawn, and not just recapturing your pawn, but with a discovered check as well. So that can be very, very dangerous, and black wins 56% of the time from this position. Okay, so that's all good. Now, let's briefly also look at pawn to d4. Okay, this is actually the best move. They shouldn't try and defend this pawn, right? Much better to focus on basic principles, control the center. This is the best move that white has according to the fish. And you now have a couple of options. You have, for example, the Portuguese Gambit with bishop to g4. I've looked into that a little bit, don't really know much about it, can't say a lot, but black wins well from here, 51%. Okay, so that's one. But if you want to go really, really, really spicy, then you can offer c6 pawn. Go, what? And if they take, right, then you can offer the e5 pawn. This is the Danish Gambit, right? And this can lead to an awful lot of fun as well. And black actually does slightly better than white as well from here. I've got separate videos on the Danish Gambit, so if you want to know more about that, look up those videos. All right, we're not far off now. e4, there are a couple of other variations, okay? If you are crazy, you may consider playing the Doughtery Gambit. The Doughtery Gambit is the immediate f5 against e4, right? Stockfish hates it, and white tends to win quite comfortably with 52% versus 45%. So you could go down that line if you are insane, right? If you're not insane, let's say you play e4, e5. What about knight c3? What about if they play the Vienna? Well, we know what we're doing here. We play knight to c6. The most common move here is bishop to c4, and then we play pawn to f5. This is the one that I'm calling the Marcellus Wallace. Okay, and we're gambiting this pawn in return for development, and we'll try and recapture that pawn again later. Same old theme, nothing new under the sun. However, in response to the Vienna, there is another line, okay? And I'm kind of curious about this one, not only because it's got the coolest name in the world, well, almost the coolest name, all right, the coolest family-friendly name in the world, but it's really, really fun as well. Okay, and this is known as the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. Okay, you bring your knight out here. Okay, and if they play bishop to c4, which is Vienna, this is like mainline Vienna. It's not the most common move, right? Knight to f3 is number one move. Pawn to f4, the Vienna Gambit, is the second move. But if they do play bishop to c4, right, then we can have some fun. Check this out. Knight takes e4, okay? Apparently giving up a knight, but of course, if they take, right, you simply have d5 here. And you're forking both pieces again. It's the same kind of patterns, just recycled in different kinds of openings, right? And this is all cool. Okay, now if they don't take, I mean they've got bishop h7, they've got queen h5. Queen h5 is an interesting one here. So they're threatening to come out and do this. That is actually the best move, and it looks fairly dodgy for black here. You have to bring your knight back here by the look of things and try and attack the bishop, and also defend f7. So yeah, slightly dubious there, but there may be some fun to be had in the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. Now, what if you're black and you face the move 1 e4? Okay, well, there are a few things that you can do. Okay, I play the England Gambit, England with a U. Okay, obviously named after Robert England, the actor who plays Freddy Krueger. Clearly, now here they could push c3 or knight c3 are both kind of okay for white, but pretty much equalizing. The best move, according to the engine by far, is to take the pawn. Now, you've also got knight f6, which we'll come on to, but we'll look at England Gambit. Okay, so England Gambit accepted. Then I am playing here the Hartlab-Charlik Gambit, where you offer pawn number 2, right? They will very often gladly accept. You recapture with your bishop, with ideas about this. So if they, at any point, castle, you might have this trap where you give check and maybe win the queen, but we shall see. In fact, what you'll usually do is develop long castle, put your queen right here, and then pull out this move and win the queen with your rook, which is now on d8. Okay, so that's the idea with that one. Right, there is another way of approaching it. Instead, after they accept the gambit, instead of d6, you can use the f-pawn. This is known as the Solar Gambit, but it's not fantastic. It's not fantastic for black, but you never know. May be playable. Now, there's a couple of other different ways that you can respond to this, right? Instead of the England Gambit, okay? So, knight to f6 is very typical. And from here, the most common move by a long way is this. And then you've got several ideas with pawn to e5, okay? The pawn to e5, they take here. You can play the Budapest Gambit with knight g4. I've tried playing this quite a bit and didn't have great success with it. Or there's a different kind of variation on that called the Fejarovich variation, where you put your knight to e5 instead of to g5. You can look into all of that nonsense if you like. Now, after they play d4, you bring out your knight, they play c4. Another option is the new Benoni, which could then lead to the Benko Gambit. Okay, this is not, I mean, you could call this a gambit, you're offering a pawn here. Okay. They don't normally take the pawn because they're thinking, well, why should I give up my central pawn and double up my pawns on the c file and stuff? So the most common move by a long way here is d5, and then you can push pawn to b5, and this is known as the Benko Gambit. With the idea, if they take, you can even offer a second pawn, recapture with the bishop, and now if the e-pawn ever moves, you can eliminate this bishop and they lose castling rights. Okay, so that's the Benko Gambit, and it does pretty well for black overall. If you want to be even more old-fashioned than that, you could go for the immediate c5 against d4, and this is known as the old Benoni. Right? The old Benoni scores 48-48 for white and black, so might be worth a look. And that's pretty much what we've got against d4 as black. And finally, let's just wrap up with any ideas against... I'm not going to do the English, because I don't know. I don't have anything against English. I probably need to look at something spicy against the English. What about bird opening? All right, or bird's opening. Here we're going to use the same theme as we just saw in the Hartlab-Charlik, right? We play From's Gambit. Okay, you offer the e-pawn. They go, yeah, I'll have that. Then you offer another one. They go, yeah, I'll have that. Okay, and you recapture here. Right now, I'm just thinking, black 1 versus e4. I think there's one we've missed. Similar theme, okay? Against the King's Gambit. So e4, e5, da 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 da. I don't know if I had this. No. So this is the Frenkel Countergambit. All right, against the King's Gambit, and it's a similar kind of idea, right? Now, if they take this pawn, that's a blunder because you get to give check and target that. Okay, did a video on that a couple of weeks ago. If they take this pawn, then you can go this Nimzovich variation. When you offer the second pawn, if they take again, you recapture with the knight, and you've already equalized here. And this is good. So this is what I'm playing against the King's Gambit as well. So this is the Frenkel Countergambit. And that concludes, boys and girls, our tour of all the gambits that Hunty knows and has played, with a couple of other weirdo ones thrown in for good measure. So who should play a gambit? you've got to be ready to throw the kitchen sink at your opponent, right? You've given up material. The fish will always disapprove because the fish always counts based on perfect play, and with perfect play, the side with more material will generally have the edge, okay? But we're playing against flesh and blood humans in the real world, and so you do have opportunities, right? If your opponent is too slow to get safe, if your opponent wastes time trying to protect gambit pawns and stuff like that, you could find yourself just having exciting, attacking, open, fun, tactical games, which is what I enjoy. It's why I play chess. I play chess to enjoy myself, right? Not for any other reason. And that's why I love gambits. It may not be what's right for you, and quite honestly, and if your ambition is to break 2,000, maybe become a title player, maybe you shouldn't be playing a bunch of gambits. Maybe you should be playing standard classical ideas as well. But this has been just a very interesting experience for me, and I think also discovering the Italian Gambit, which I honestly never knew existed before, but looks really spicy. Lots of fun. So I may even just look into that one myself. But yeah, time for me to catch my breath. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you soon.